Eala win that? The crowd are on their feet. Eala barely has the energy to get to the net to congratulate her opponent on a classic.
So we've just seen Chen and Eala dominate the number 2 seeds and half of the winning team in the Australian Open. Zhang, who was actually in the team with Buksha, did win the Australian Open a couple weeks ago. So massive win for them and massive win for Southeast Asia.
The entire tennis world suddenly froze when Novak Djokovic spoke Alex Eala's name. This wasn't casual praise. This wasn't polite encouragement. When the greatest player the sport has ever seen chooses his words carefully, every sentence carries weight. So when Djokovic openly labeled Alex Eala a superstar during a press conference, it sent shockwaves far beyond that room. One statement, one moment, and the direction of her career quietly shifted. But what exactly did Novak say, and why does it matter more than most people realize? Before we break it all down, drop a comment and tell me this. Did you already know who Alex Eala was before everything exploded, or did this chaos introduce her to you for the first time? Now here's how it all unfolded. During what was supposed to be a routine Australian Open press conference, Novak Djokovic was asked a familiar question. After more than 20 years of competing in Melbourne, how did he feel the tournament had changed? The interviewer mentioned the massive crowds, the surge of sponsorship money, and the growing criticism that the event had become overly commercial and overwhelming. It was the kind of question Novak has answered countless times, until his response took an unexpected turn.
I saw the other day with Alex Eala, that's been a talk, and which is understandable. There's some players coming from respective countries, like she's coming from Philippines, which is now a big deal. She's been the biggest ever, tennis player from that country, which is a big country, and there's a big interest. So things like that happen. I mean, it's you could argue that it was, maybe a poor schedule, and maybe they could schedule him on a bigger court. Yes, but again, she's so young and she's just coming through. So, and obviously the first couple rounds, the schedule is so packed. The big courts with big names, it's difficult. It's not easy to manage that. But again, it's a good problem to have, to be honest. Let's just imagine if there's a lack of people coming, or that stands are empty. That's a bigger problem.
Most players would have answered the question with a safe, recycled line about how it's wonderful to see tennis grow and how packed stadiums are a blessing for the sport. But Novak Djokovic never operates on autopilot, and that's exactly why people stop listening when he speaks and start paying attention. Instead of praising the crowds in a generic way, he flipped the entire argument on its head. He said that every tournament organizer on the planet dreams of selling out tickets and smashing attendance records, and complaining about too many fans is what he called a luxury problem. The kind of problem you only have when your sport is alive, thriving, and pulling people in faster than you can manage them. Then he delivered a line that perfectly captured his mindset, saying that having too many supporters is one of the worst nightmares an event can face, but also one of the clearest signs that it's doing something right. That balance between realism and perspective is pure Djokovic, shaped by someone who has watched the Australian Open transform with his own eyes over more than 2 decades. He's been around long enough to remember when the tournament wasn't this polished global spectacle, when players warmed up in borrowed spaces and makeshift facilities rather than 5-star recovery centers. He even laughed while recalling how he used to train in a gym owned by an Australian rules football club across the street, stumbling over the team's name before correcting himself and apologizing to fans because local rivalries in Australia are serious business. That small moment humanized the story, but it also reinforced his larger point, which was that the Australian Open didn't sell its soul to become what it is today. It survived, adapted, and grew. What once felt like a tournament scraping by with borrowed resources has evolved into a world-class event with indoor arenas, luxury player housing, advanced medical facilities, and a global audience that keeps expanding every single year. For Djokovic, that evolution isn't something to mourn, it's evidence that tennis is winning. The sport didn't lose its identity, it earned its relevance. But just as the conversation seemed to settle into familiar territory, Djokovic shifted gears, and that's when Alex Eala entered the picture and changed the entire tone of the press conference. He started talking about what had happened on one of the smaller outer courts earlier in the tournament, where thousands of fans flooded the area trying to watch a single match. Security was stretched thin, movement broke down, logistics collapsed, and chaos followed. According to Djokovic, it became the talk of the locker room, not because of mismanagement alone, but because of what it represented. He explained that tournament officials shouldn't view the situation as a failure or a disaster, but as proof of something much bigger happening right in front of them. In his words, they probably should have anticipated the reaction and scheduled her on a bigger court, but the real story wasn't the crowd control problem, it was why so many people showed up in the first place. Alex Eala wasn't just another promising young player trying to climb the rankings, she was representing an entire country that had been waiting decades for a moment like this. The Philippines, a nation of over 110 million people, had never experienced this level of international attention in tennis, and suddenly they had someone they could rally behind on the biggest stages in the sport. When Djokovic referred to Eala as a superstar, it wasn't a casual compliment or polite encouragement, it was recognition from the greatest player in history that this was something different. He wasn't talking about rankings or trophies, he was talking about impact. He understood that Eala had crossed a line that most players take years to approach, becoming more than an athlete and turning into a cultural symbol almost overnight. That's where the irony comes in, because the Australian Open placed a player backed by a country of 110 million people on a court designed for a few hundred spectators and seemed surprised when the situation exploded. The sarcasm practically writes itself, because what exactly did organizers expect to happen? Did they think fans would politely stay away and watch on their phones while their national icon played live just meters away? The meltdown wasn't just bad luck, it was a sign of how disconnected parts of the tennis establishment still are from the way the sports audience is changing. For decades, tournaments have operated on the assumption that only established Western stars can draw massive crowds, but Eala shattered that illusion in real time. She proved that tennis is becoming more global than the infrastructure and scheduling models were built to handle. Djokovic made this point without attacking anyone, calmly explaining that moments like these are inevitable when the sport expands into new regions with hungry, emotionally invested fan bases. He saw the chaos not as a warning sign, but as a preview of what's coming next. New markets are waking up, new audiences are showing up in force, and the old systems aren't flexible enough to absorb that energy smoothly. This is where the conversation stopped being about one match and turned into a reflection on tennis as a whole. The scheduling, court assignments, and promotional strategies that have worked for years were designed for a slower path to stardom, where players gradually rise through rankings, slowly build recognition, and eventually earn center court status. Eala's rise didn't follow that script at all. One moment she was a talented young prospect, and the next she was carrying the attention, pride, and expectations of an entire nation. That kind of instant cultural relevance doesn't fit neatly into spreadsheets or traditional broadcast plans, and when the system fails to account for it, confusion and backlash are guaranteed. Djokovic recognized this immediately because he's lived it himself. He knows what it feels like to represent more than just yourself every time you walk onto the court, to carry the hopes of millions who see your success as their own. Even though Serbia's population is much smaller than that of the Philippines, the emotional weight is similar, and Djokovic didn't romanticize it. He described fame as a golden cage, something that gives you power and opportunity but can just as easily overwhelm you if you aren't ready. For a teenager like Eala, still learning how to navigate professional tennis, that pressure is enormous. Winning matches and improving her ranking is only part of the battle, because every victory and loss now resonates far beyond the scoreboard. The crowd scene at her match wasn't just a group of excited spectators, it was a wave of believers who traveled, waited, and pushed through obstacles just to witness her presence. They weren't there for a routine early round match, they were there to support someone who represents their identity on a global stage. That's why Djokovic chose to appreciate the chaos instead of condemning it, because he understands that when a sport grows faster than its infrastructure, moments like this are unavoidable, and sometimes even necessary. What makes Alex Eala's rise even more fascinating is how quickly everything has happened, because tennis stardom has traditionally been built like a slow-burning fire where players spend years grinding through lower tournaments, gradually climbing the rankings, and slowly gaining recognition from fans and sponsors. But Eala's journey feels more like someone flipped a switch and instantly illuminated her on the global stage. One moment she was known mainly among hardcore tennis followers and development circuits, and the next she was being followed passionately by millions of supporters who saw her as a national icon. That kind of overnight transformation creates a unique and complicated situation, because the entire sport system is still structured around the old timeline of fame. Court scheduling, media obligations, television planning, and promotional marketing strategies all assume that popularity grows step by step, but when a player explodes into worldwide relevance because of cultural and national significance rather than ranking position, the system struggles to keep up. This disconnect is exactly why Djokovic's comments carried so much importance, because he has personally experienced what it feels like to carry the emotional expectations of an entire country every time he steps onto a court. He understands that the pride and support of millions can be both empowering and suffocating at the same time. When he described fame as living inside a golden cage, he wasn't exaggerating. He was describing a reality where the admiration that lifts you can also trap you in constant pressure if you are not mentally prepared. For someone as young as Eala, who is still learning how to survive the intensity of professional competition, that pressure multiplies quickly. She isn't just playing matches anymore. She is performing in front of millions of people who see her victories as personal triumphs and her losses as collective heartbreak. The wild crowd scene during her Australian Open match proved that perfectly, because those fans weren't simply excited spectators hoping to watch good tennis. They were deeply invested believers who traveled long distances, waited in overwhelming lines, and pushed through heavy crowds just to witness her presence in person. Their connection to her went far beyond sports entertainment. It represented pride, identity, and representation on a global stage. That emotional intensity is what transforms a regular early-round match into something that feels larger than matches played on main stadium courts, and Djokovic recognized that instantly. Instead of criticizing the chaos or blaming tournament officials, he framed the moment as an unavoidable side effect of tennis expanding into new cultural territories with passionate fan bases that had been waiting years for someone like Eala to emerge. He pointed out that Grand Slam tournaments are always chaotic during the opening week because of overlapping storylines and packed schedules, but the emergence of players with enormous national followings adds an entirely new layer of complexity. Tennis audiences are no longer driven purely by rankings and trophy counts. They are increasingly motivated by cultural representation and national pride, and that shift changes everything about how tournaments need to operate. When the greatest player in history publicly endorses a young athlete like Eala, two powerful consequences immediately unfold. First, it validates the excitement surrounding her and confirms that the buzz is not simply emotional nationalism or temporary hype, because when someone with Djokovic's experience and achievements calls you a superstar, it signals to the entire tennis world that your impact is real and worth taking seriously. Second, his endorsement acts as a shield against the inevitable criticism that follows sudden fame. There will always be skeptics who argue that she hasn't achieved enough results to deserve such attention or that the spotlight is exaggerated, but Djokovic's support shuts down many of those arguments before they gain momentum, essentially telling the tennis community that they must adapt to this new reality because players like Eala represent the sport's evolving future. The contrast between today's Australian Open and the version Djokovic entered early in his career perfectly highlights this evolution. He described how players once shared ice baths with football teams and relied on borrowed training facilities, while today's tournament offers world-class infrastructure and luxury accommodations designed to support elite performance. That transformation happened because tennis invested in global expansion and commercial growth, and while increased sponsorship and corporate influence can attract criticism, they also fund the prize money, facilities, and exposure that keep the sport competitive at the highest level. However, growth inevitably introduces new challenges, and Eala's situation exposes one of the biggest questions tennis now faces, which is how to handle players whose cultural significance and fan support exceed their ranking or tournament seeding. Djokovic emphasized that packed stadiums and overwhelming fan demand are positive problems to solve, because the worst scenario for any sport is public indifference. When thousands of fans fight for space to watch a young Filipino player compete on an outer court, it proves that tennis is breaking into new markets and attracting audiences that previously had little connection to the sport, and that kind of expansion is essential for long-term sustainability. Short-term logistical problems like overcrowding and scheduling conflicts can be solved through better planning, larger venues, and improved crowd management strategies, but declining fan interest is far more difficult to fix once it begins. The deeper and unspoken question raised by this situation is whether tennis leadership is truly prepared for this new era of globalization. For decades, the sport has been dominated by players from a relatively small group of countries, but emerging stars from regions like Southeast Asia are bringing massive fan communities that don't fit traditional marketing or scheduling models. Tournaments must decide whether they are willing to evolve and treat these players as central figures in tennis's future or continue placing them on secondary courts and acting surprised when fan chaos erupts. Eala's journey has become a test case for how the sport responds to globalization, because successfully integrating new audiences without alienating existing fans would represent a major victory for tennis, while resisting change could create missed opportunities that slow the sport's global relevance. Djokovic clearly believes Eala is not a temporary phenomenon but a crucial figure in tennis's future landscape. His tone carried respect and seriousness rather than condescension, treating her as a legitimate peer despite her early stage in professional competition, and that attitude is significant because it comes from a player who has won more Grand Slam titles than anyone else and has earned the authority to define standards within the sport. By elevating her instead of dismissing her, Djokovic demonstrated his understanding that tennis cannot rely solely on its traditional Western superstars to maintain global appeal, because the sport's survival depends on welcoming diverse players who can attract new audiences and sustain international interest. Eala fits that vision perfectly, which means her career success or failure will influence more than just her personal achievements. It will shape how tennis evolves in the coming years. The future now holds several crucial questions that fans and analysts are watching closely. Can Eala handle the overwhelming expectations placed on her shoulders and develop into the player supporters believe she can become? Will major tournaments adjust their scheduling, marketing, and promotional strategies to accommodate athletes with massive cultural followings after witnessing the Australian Open chaos? And perhaps most importantly, will the tennis establishment fully embrace this new generation of global stars or continue relying on outdated systems that no longer reflect the sport's shifting demographics? Djokovic's endorsement provides Eala with credibility and protection as she navigates these challenges, because when critics inevitably question her rapid rise, she can rely on recognition from one of the greatest champions in tennis history as validation of her importance. That endorsement acts as armor against those who attempt to diminish her success or dismiss her popularity as undeserved hype. Meanwhile, the broader debate about whether the Australian Open and other tournaments have become overly commercial misses the deeper reality that financial investment and sponsorship are essential for maintaining elite competition, because world-class tennis cannot exist without world-class funding. The real challenge lies in balancing commercial growth with authenticity and competitive integrity, and tennis has largely managed to preserve that balance so far by ensuring that talent and performance remain the ultimate deciding factors in success. As long as the matches remain intense, rivalries stay genuine, and players continue delivering unforgettable performances, the corporate elements remain background noise rather than the defining feature of the sport. In the end, Djokovic's comments were far more than simple praise. They were a declaration that tennis is entering a new chapter defined by globalization, cultural representation, and rapidly expanding fan bases. He didn't just compliment Alex Eala, he positioned her as a symbol of where tennis is heading and challenged the sport's leadership to prepare for a future that looks very different from its past. The chaos surrounding her match wasn't a failure. It was a preview of how tennis is transforming in ways nobody can ignore, and whether the sport adapts successfully could determine its global relevance for decades to come.